Hello, comrades and friends. Many like to say that Stalin and the communists were genocidal and have always wanted to kill off the Soviet nation. As an example, they always bring up the Ukrainian population during the 1933 famine and consider it to be a genocide. To fully understand this, we must take a look at what genocide really is. Under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in the UN, Article 2 states, "In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethical, racial, or religious group." The key word here is intent. Therefore, I want anyone to show me proof of high-ranking officials or even Stalin talking about genocide, i.e. if they had an intention to destroy the Ukrainian population. There are no documents to prove this whatsoever. My personal research of the archives has been unsuccessful in finding evidence for this claim either. Alexander Dallin of Stanford University can back me up. He stated that there is no evidence it was intentionally directed against Ukrainians. Furthermore, Stephen Wheatcroft, professor from the University of Melbourne, and Robert William Davies, professor from the University of Birmingham, had to say this, I quote, "Popular media and most historians for decades have described the Great Famine that struck most of the USSR in the early 1930s as man-made, very often even a genocide that Stalin perpetrated intentionally against Ukrainians and sometimes other national groups to destroy them as nations. This perspective, however, is wrong. The famine that took place was not limited to Ukraine or even rural areas of the USSR. It was not fundamentally or exclusively man-made, and it was far from the intention of Stalin and the others in the Soviet leadership to create such a disaster. A small but growing literature relying on new archival documents and a critical approach to other sources has shown the flaws in the genocide or intentionalist interpretation of the famine and has developed an alternative interpretation." With that, the video should have come to an end, because it is innocent until proven guilty. However, for the sake of teaching the viewer, I will try to analyze one of the only major famines in the USSR from a neutral perspective. Firstly, I want to debunk the popular socialism equals no food myth. It is a very outdated myth that has no real backup. This can be proven by official CIA reports, which state, on average, the Soviet diet is more nutritious, with 3,280 calories on average, while the American diet is 3,520 calories on average. This can even be said about modern North Korea, where life expectancy is 71 years, which is quite high for a poor country like the DPRK. Furthermore, death from malnutrition in North Korea is 1 per 100,000 people, according to the World Health Organization. This number beats Western countries such as the United States and France. Now, we shall examine the Holodomor. The famine that struck Ukraine was not only experienced there, but was also affected in the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic, the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic, as well as reports from regions in Kyrgyzia stating that they are also having problems with food, while the heads of the Bashkir Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic wrote a telegram to Stalin and Molotov stating that they are experiencing a famine. Thus, from this we can see that the famine happened in all parts of the Soviet Union and was not directed towards Ukrainians. So what were some of the reasons for the famine, you may ask? Mark Tolger, professor of history at West Virginia University, notes, the USSR experienced an unusual environmental disaster in 1932, extremely wet and humid weather that gave rise to severe plant disease infestations, especially rust. Ukraine had double or tripled the normal rainfall in 1932. Both the weather conditions and the rust spread from Eastern Europe reduced the potential harvest in 1932 by almost 9 million tons, which is the largest documented harvest loss from any single cause in Soviet history. Furthermore, the Soviets were deeply worried about global events such as the Great Depression, as well as those unfolding in the East, such as the Mukden incident and the Japanese invasion that followed. So in analyzing the USSR's actions, we must always look at global events in order to see why the Soviets made this or that decision. The Soviets believed that the Japanese could invade from the East. judging by their aggressive foreign policy, while also being invaded from the West by capitalist powers after the 1927 clash with Britain. Therefore, they wanted to industrialize much quicker. In order to do so, they needed to collectivize. Collectivization is closely linked to industrialization, as they go hand in hand. I will talk about this in one of my upcoming videos about collectivization. However, this collectivization was rushed and resulted in being aggressive and brutal at times. There were many reports and letters sent to Stalin in which peasants were beaten and tortured. While those who did these acts were later punished, it leaves a dark moment in Soviet history. This does not mean people didn't want to join kolkhozes. Most farmers joined willingly. It was only rich farmers that had to be forced to collectivize. Overall, this brutal collectivization led to many slaughtering their animals. For example, the Central SD of the USSR reported that in 1929 there were almost 35,000 horses, while in 1933 that number dropped down to 16,645. Similarly, goat, sheep, and pig numbers in 1929 were almost 150,000. By 1933, that number dropped down to 50,000. This drop in farm animals in part led to the famine that struck Ukraine and other parts of the USSR. Furthermore, the Soviet government starting from 1931 started to demand kolkhozes in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Russia to sell 40% of the harvest to the government. This number can be seen in Anastas Mikoyan's report to Stalin. Keep in mind, farms in the USSR were not state-owned. They were privately owned and grain was bought from these farms. However, this 40% rate cannot go for long and becomes one of the reasons for the famine. Some individuals may wonder, what was the Soviet response to the famine? The famine struck the Soviet leadership and made them work on their mistakes. In 1933, the Soviet government published a new document in which it lowered the demanded harvest percentage. By 1937, the demanded harvest percentage became 14%. There was no longer the absurd 40% number. However, to combat the famine at the time, the Soviet government sent 5,500 tractors to the Ukrainian SSR. Furthermore, 35,000 tons of grain was to be taken into the Ukrainian ports, while 600,000 puds of grain and 75 train wagons of fish were to be sent to Ukraine immediately, while also decreasing grain export by 5 times. Therefore, the USSR did try to restrain the famine straight away. Overall, we can conclude that the reasons for the famine were natural causes, peasants killing farm animals due to brutality conducted by the government, and Soviet mismanagement of the situation. We must understand and see what the mistakes of the USSR were in order to never repeat them if we are to build a socialist future. However, this tragedy was not a genocide, as the Soviet government did not deliberately starve its population, but on the contrary tried to stop the famine while even learning from their previous mistakes and working on them. This can be observed from the fact that this was indeed the last major famine in the USSR. Thank you for your time, comrades. See you next time.